So, uh, if you were sitting in the cockpit of a commercial airliner and you look down at the instrument panel, you'd logically expect all those glowing dials to tell you, like, a single coherent story about the physical reality of your flight.
Right, you want the instruments to match up.
Exactly. Like, if your altimeter says you are rocketing past 30,000 feet, you'd expect the engine thrust to be running high, the fuel lines to be flowing steadily, the cabin pressure to be perfectly stable. The systems have to work together to keep you in the air.
All interdependent, yeah.
But imagine looking at that dashboard, and the altimeter shows you're climbing faster than almost any other plane in the sky. Yet right next to it, the fuel gauge is flashing completely empty. The engine temperature is pinned in the red, warning of a catastrophic meltdown. And, a secondary light is flashing to tell you that the landing gear's sheared off entirely.
Most pilots would assume there was a catastrophic sensor failure, right? They'd think the dashboard itself was feeding them impossible physics because, well, a machine cannot sustain a vertical climb while its core systems are actively disintegrating.
Exactly. But what if the sensors were perfectly accurate? What if the plane was actually climbing and simultaneously falling apart? That is the structural mystery we are bringing to you today. We're taking you on a deep dive into what we're calling the transformation paradox.
And it really is a paradox in every sense of the word.
It is. And to unpack this for you, we are looking at the nation of Ethiopia. We have this massive, incredibly detailed presentation deck on the table today. It's an empirical study based on a half-century of continuous macroeconomic, demographic, social, and environmental data sets. We're pulling from the World Bank, the IMF, the UN. It's a huge stack of sources.
It's an incredibly dense repository of human history, really, just translated into millions of data points. We are tracking a nation's vital signs across decades.
Everything from GDP and inflation curves to infant mortality rates.
Yeah, and crop yields, greenhouse gas emissions, and even the granular tracking of what percentage of the population has access to a bar of soap.
Right. And our mission for you, the listener, is to use this data to build a multifaceted understanding of one of the most complex global shifts happening on the planet right now. And we want to do this without drowning you in academic jargon.
Which is easy to do with this much data.
Oh, for sure. Because the hook here, the core paradox we need to solve, is how a single country can experience jaw-dropping, exponential economic growth, literally generating trillions in GDP alongside massive historic public health victories while simultaneously battling extreme vulnerabilities.
The vulnerabilities are severe. We are talking about hyperinflation that destroys wealth overnight, severe childhood malnutrition, and a heavy, almost existential reliance on foreign aid.
Yeah, how do these conflicting realities occupy the exact same physical space?
That is the defining question of modern development economics. And as we dig into these sources, it is vital to remember that these aren't just numbers on a sterile spreadsheet. Macro data is the heartbeat of a nation. It tells the story of human lives, of systemic struggles, and of structural triumphs. The goal today is to help you look past those flashy, top-line headlines you might read in a financial paper, the ones that just scream, unprecedented GDP takeoff, and understand the structural mechanisms operating underneath the surface.
Because if you only look at the GDP, you're only seeing that altimeter climbing. You're entirely blind to the flashing warning lights.
Exactly. You miss the whole picture.
Let's start by looking at the sheer scale of the human element, because before we can even begin to talk about the money, we have to talk about the people generating it. The demographic shifts in this data set are staggering. If we look at the historical timeline, the total population surged from roughly 21.3 million people to over 132 million.
It is an incredible multiplication of a populace in a relatively narrow historical window. You're looking at a society that has fundamentally reshaped its physical footprint.
And that footprint is the part that genuinely confused me when I first read through the source material. Because, when you hear about a population exploding from 20 million to over 130 million, the standard assumption is urbanization.
Right, you picture megacities springing up.
Yeah, massive high-rises, urban sprawl taking over the horizon. But the data shows that despite some urban expansion, over 76% of that massive population remains firmly rooted in rural areas.
Which is a huge structural anchor.
Think about the geography of that for a second. It's like adding the entirety of a major European country, say Germany or France, to the map every single decade. But instead of those people filling up highly dense, electrified metropolitan centers, they're mostly expanding outward into rural farming villages. The sheer geographic spread of humanity is massive.
The spatial distribution you're highlighting is the crucial context for everything else we will discuss. When a population explodes like this, primarily because mortality rates begin to drop while birth rates remain high, you create what economists call a youth bulge.
Okay, a youth bulge.
Yeah, you end up with a massive, highly youthful population. Now, the traditional economic theory looks at this youth bulge and identifies a demographic dividend.
A dividend meaning a massive payoff waiting to be collected.
In theory, yes. The mechanism is fairly straightforward on paper. You suddenly have a huge potential labor pool entering their most productive years. If the state can harness that energy, if they can put those millions of young hands and minds to work, the sheer volume of labor can drive incredible industrial and economic growth.
Right, because the ratio of working-age adults to dependents, meaning the very old and the very young, shifts favorably. There are more people producing wealth than consuming it.
Exactly. But the data implies a massive catch to that theory. The demographic dividend isn't automatic, it is highly conditional. This youth bulge places immense, almost unimaginable carrying capacity pressure on a nation's physical and social infrastructure.
Before a single one of those young people can enter the workforce and generate $1 of GDP, they have to be fed.
They have to be housed. They need safe drinking water, vaccinations, and a decade of schooling.
So if 76% of these 132 million people are spread out across rural, often difficult, mountainous terrain, the logistics of just keeping them alive and educating them before they even hit working age is a monumental task.
It's a logistical nightmare.
So if the state fails to deliver those services across that vast geography, does that dividend become a burden?
It absolutely becomes a demographic vulnerability. You risk massive youth unemployment, social unrest, and deepening poverty. The state is essentially racing against the biological clock of its own population. They have to build the infrastructure faster than the children are growing up.
Wow.
Now, if you juxtapose that intense population pressure with the economic data in our sources, you start to see the first layer of the paradox.
Because the economic data looks like an absolute triumph.
Yeah.
If we look at the gross domestic product, measured in constant local currency, the GDP skyrocketed from roughly 930 million to over 2.34 trillion.
It's an unbelievable trajectory.
And if you look at the data visualization for this in the reports, imagine a minimalist academic graph, pure white background, just a stark, smooth line tracking the GDP. It doesn't just trend upward, it curves exponentially. Starting just after the year 2000, that line points almost straight toward the ceiling.
Right. And gross national income per capita, the actual wealth per person, also lifted significantly from its historical baseline.
It is a textbook macroeconomic takeoff in terms of sheer volume. Following the turn of the millennium, there was a concerted, highly structured effort, heavily supported by external capital and state-led infrastructure investment, to forcefully jumpstart the economy.
Yeah, the state poured money into roads, dams, and industrial parks. The numbers reflect a nation that suddenly shifted into high gear, generating wealth at a pace that is dizzying compared to its historical average.
But I want to pause on a term you used, and that the data highlights constant local currency. When I'm looking at these trillions, why is the data specifically adjusted this way, rather than just showing us nominal dollars?
That's a vital distinction for understanding real economic growth. Nominal GDP just measures the total value of everything produced at current market prices. But if a country experiences massive inflation, which, as we will see, is a massive factor here, the nominal GDP will look artificially huge just because prices went up, not because the country actually produced more goods.
Okay. That makes sense.
By measuring in constant local currency, the economists strip out the illusion of inflation. They anchor the value to a specific base year. So when we see that exponential curve from 930 million to 2.34 trillion, we're seeing actual physical increases in goods, services, and economic activity, not just inflated price tags.
Okay, so the growth is real, physically real.
Yeah.
This brings up a massive logical friction point. If 76% of these 132 million people are rural, how exactly is the economy physically generating trillions in real GDP? I mean, are these rural populations just farming incredibly efficiently? Did they suddenly invent a new, hyperproductive way to grow coffee and teff that prints money?
No, not exactly. To figure out where the money is actually coming from, we have to look past the top-line GDP number and dig into the structural shift of the economy. We need to look at the value-added percentage of GDP by sector. And when we look at that specific data set, we see a very distinct anomaly. The data outlines what you can call a scissor effect.
Let's break down that scissor effect. What are the two blades?
Imagine a graph tracking the three main sectors of any economy: agriculture, industry, and services. For a very long time in this data set, the line representing agriculture's dominance was the highest point on the chart. It was the absolute unquestioned backbone of the GDP.
Right.
But over the last few decades, that agriculture line has steadily declined as a percentage of total value. Meanwhile, the line representing the services sector has spiked dramatically. It's sliced right up through the agriculture line, creating that scissor intersection. Recently, services have approached or even exceeded 40% of the total GDP.
So the economy is moving away from the farm and into the service sector. But what about the middle step? What about the industry line?
That is the critical anomaly. While services skyrocketed and agriculture dipped, the line representing industry and manufacturing, the factories, the assembly lines remained noticeably stagnant. It hovered at a low level, barely twitching, while the rest of the economy transformed around it.
Wait, I need to make sure I understand the mechanics of this, because it feels like building the roof of a house before you pour the foundation.
Yeah.
The traditional macroeconomic playbook, the one used by the United States, Europe, and especially the Asian tiger economies like South Korea or Taiwan, is highly sequential.
Very sequential, yes.
You move from subsistence farming to low-wage manufacturing. You build massive textile mills, you build assembly lines, you put millions of former farmers into factories making physical goods for export. That absorbs the massive youth bulge. Then, once you have an established middle class, capital accumulation, and a highly structured industrial base, then you transition to a service-based economy, like banking, software, and retail.
You are describing the standard, universally accepted gospel of the Industrial Revolution model. It is the pathway that lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty in the 20th century.
But the data here shows Ethiopia is essentially bypassing the industrial and manufacturing phase entirely. They're skipping the factory floor and jumping straight from the farm to the service sector. How does that physically work?
It's a huge leap.
If you have millions of rural workers entering the economy, doesn't a service-based economy demand a totally different skill set than assembly line manufacturing? You can teach a former farmer to operate a mechanical loom or bolt a car door pretty quickly with minimal literacy. Can you teach them to be a software developer, a financial analyst, or a corporate consultant overnight?
You've hit on the exact friction point of the structural paradox. This quirk in the data explains why the industrialization phase is still in its infancy. It is an economy leaping into the future while its workforce is still structurally tied to the past. The disconnect happens when we hear the word services.
Okay, how so?
Well, in the West, we hear services, and we picture a high-tech coding job, a corporate law firm, or investment banking. But in a developing economy that skips the manufacturing phase, the services sector looks radically different.
So what are these services, practically speaking, on the ground?
It is largely driven by the informal economy. Services here means millions of people engaging in informal retail, buying goods in bulk and selling them individually on the street. It means small-scale logistics, driving a minibus or a motorcycle taxi.
Ah, I see.
It means basic telecommunications like selling mobile phone airtime or running a small mobile money kiosk. It is the hospitality sector, small restaurants, and domestic work.
It's transactional survival, basically.
Exactly. It is growth, and it does generate GDP, but it lacks the structural permanence of industrialization. Think about the difference in economic gravity. A massive shoe factory employs 10,000 people on fixed taxable wages. It requires a supply chain of rubber, canvas, and machinery. It forces the government to build reliable power grids and paved roads to the port. It creates a massive, stable economic ecosystem.
But 10,000 guys driving motorcycle taxis or selling SIM cards on the street don't force the government to build a power grid.
No, they don't. It doesn't have the same mass employment sponge effect. It doesn't aggregate capital the way manufacturing does. So you end up with a dual-track economy. You have a rapidly modernizing, largely urban service sector driving these massive top-line GDP numbers, existing alongside a vast, structurally traditional rural population that is still engaged in low-yield agriculture.
So the trillion-dollar GDP number is real, but the foundation it rests on is structurally shallow. Which brings us to a terrifying question. What happens to the guy selling SIM cards or driving the minibus when the macroeconomy starts to overheat?
That's the danger zone.
Because all this GDP growth sounds incredible on a chart, trillions of local currency units. But we have to look at what that money actually buys for the average citizen in their daily life.
Which brings us to the most destabilizing metric in our entire source, stack the silent thief of hyperinflation.
The data on the Consumer Price Index, the CPI, is genuinely alarming. We aren't talking about the standard 2 or 3% annual inflation that central banks in developed nations try to manage. The data reveals intense, aggressive volatility. We are looking at annual CPI growth rates that frequently break the 30% barrier, hitting staggering catastrophic peaks like 44.3%.
We need to unpack the physical mechanism of what 44.3% inflation actually does to human beings, because it is the ultimate macro illusion. GDP growth is entirely meaningless to a subsistence farmer or an urban day laborer if hyperinflation is quietly functioning as a massive regressive tax.
Let's trace that mechanism for the listeners. Say I'm that guy driving the motorcycle taxi in the service sector. I save up the equivalent of $100 in local currency in January. I hide it under my mattress to pay for my kids' school fees at the end of the year. If inflation hits 44% by December, that $100 can only buy me what $56 used to buy. Almost half of the value of my labor, my sweat, my savings just evaporated into thin air without anyone physically robbing my house.
And the cruelty of inflation is how selectively it punishes the population. It is a regressive tax, meaning it hurts the poorest citizens exponentially more than the wealthy. Wealthy individuals hold their wealth in assets. They own land, commercial real estate, foreign currency accounts, or equities.
Right, their wealth is tied up in things that gain value.
Exactly. When a government prints too much money or a supply chain collapses and inflation spikes, the nominal price of real estate or foreign currency usually rises to match the inflation. The wealthy are insulated. Their net worth adjusts upward.
But the poor don't own real estate.
No. The poor citizens hold whatever meager wealth they have in cash. Or worse, they rely on fixed daily wages that are highly sticky, meaning their boss isn't going to increase their daily pay by 44% just because the cost of bread went up. Furthermore, the poorest segments of society spend a vastly disproportionate amount of their income, sometimes up to 70 or 80% strictly on food.
So when food prices spike,
When agricultural inflation spikes, it doesn't just mean they have less disposable income, it means they literally reduce their caloric intake. Hyperinflation actively steals the calories off their plates, deepening their vulnerability to extreme poverty, even as the national GDP chart points aggressively to the sky.
it perfectly illustrates the paradox. The national pie is getting massively bigger, but the value of the slice in the worker's hand is melting. You could have a multi-trillion-dollar economy, but if the cost of basic sorghum or wheat triples in a single year, the people generating that GDP are still starving.
The transition from financial abstraction to physical consequence is immediate here because to see the real human impact of this volatile, structurally unbalanced economy, we have to pivot our focus from the health of the currency to the physical health of the bodies generating it.
And here, the source data presents another incredible contradiction. We are looking at one of the greatest public health victories of the modern era, standing directly next to its own stunted shadow.
It's a really stark contrast.
Let's focus on the victory first, because the numbers here are genuinely awe-inspiring. We are looking at a historic, gravity-defying plunge in mortality rates. The data shows infant mortality dropping precipitously from a bleak, heartbreaking historical high of roughly 158 deaths per 1,000 live births, all the way down to 35.7.
It's phenomenal.
And that free fall is perfectly mirrored by similar, massive drops in under-5 child mortality. If you visualize this, it's a thick, bold, downward arrow on a chart, signaling a massive triumph in keeping children alive.
From a purely logistical and medical standpoint, it is an astounding achievement, but we must examine the how. This drop wasn't accidental, and it wasn't simply a byproduct of the rising GDP. It is the result of highly effective, highly targeted, and aggressive medical interventions deployed over a span of decades. We are talking about widespread national vaccination campaigns pushing deep into those rural areas we discussed earlier.
Right.
And crucially, we are talking about the rollout of basic survival treatments that are dirt cheap, but biologically revolutionary.
You're talking about things like oral rehydration salts, or ORS, for treating diarrheal diseases, right?
Yes. Diarrheal diseases, often caused by contaminated water, were historically one of the leading killers of infants globally. An infant doesn't die of the bacteria itself, they die of the rapid, catastrophic loss of fluids and electrolytes. The blood volume drops, the organs fail.
And ORS is essentially just a specific ratio of sugar, salt, and water. How does something so simple create a statistical miracle?
It is a brilliant biological hack. If you just give a child suffering from severe diarrhea plain water, their compromised intestines can't absorb it, it just passes through. But scientists discovered a specific co-transport mechanism in the cellular lining of the human intestine.
Okay, code transport mechanism.
Yeah, if you combine a specific concentration of sodium salt with glucose sugar, the glucose actively pulls the sodium across the intestinal wall, and the sodium drags the water molecules right along with it directly into the bloodstream. It bypasses the bacterial disruption entirely. By distributing millions of these tiny, cheap packets across rural clinics, health workers fundamentally altered the mortality curve of the entire nation.
So by combining those biological hacks with a massive influx of international health assistance, the building of rural health outposts, and the training of local health extension workers, they stopped the dying. The babies are surviving. That is the miracle.
It is.
But the data set forces us to look at the shadow. Because while the kids are surviving, the data on their quality of life is incredibly stubborn.
It is deeply concerning. The data reveals incredibly high, persistent rates of malnutrition. Specifically, we are looking at huge percentages of children under the age of 5 facing severe stunting and wasting. The data tracks these numbers falling dangerously below the World Health Organization's alert thresholds.
We need to define those terms clearly. What is the physical difference between wasting and stunting?
Wasting is acute malnutrition. It means a child is dangerously thin for their height, usually caused by a sudden, severe lack of food or a recent bout of intense disease. It is an immediate, life-threatening crisis. Stunting, on the other hand, is chronic malnutrition. It means a child is too short for their age because they have been deprived of adequate nutrition over a long, sustained period, usually starting in the womb and continuing through their first 2 years of life.
So the medical interventions, the vaccines, and the ORS packets patch the holes to keep the ship from sinking. They stop the immediate causes of death like infection and dehydration. But they don't solve the chronic systemic lack of caloric and nutritional intake driven by that poverty and inflation we just discussed. The kids survive, but they are still starving.
And we must elevate this from a physical tragedy to a macroeconomic crisis, because they are deeply intertwined. Economists use a metric called the Human Capital Index, or HCI. Stunting isn't just a physical measurement of height. When a child is chronically malnourished in the first 1,000 days of life, their biology goes into a ruthless triage mode. The body has a limited amount of energy, and it prioritizes keeping the vital organs, the heart, the lungs, running.
What gets sacrificed in that triage?
The brain. The physical architecture of the brain, the neural pathways, the synapses simply do not form properly without adequate lipids, proteins, and micronutrients. The damage is permanent and irreversible.
This completely changes the context of the demographic dividend we talked about earlier.
It shatters it. Stunting is an invisible, permanent erosion of the future workforce's intellectual potential. If a significant percentage of your youth population is cognitively stunted before they even reach kindergarten, how do they eventually participate in that modernizing service sector economy? How do they learn advanced mathematics, adapt to complex technological changes, or innovate? The biological deficit of a 2-year-old today becomes the hard economic bottleneck of the entire nation 20 years from now.
If that biological foundation is compromised by malnutrition, what happens when those kids age into the system? How is the state attempting to build its intellectual capital? To figure out if they can even participate in this new economy, we have to look inside the classrooms. We have to look at the education data. And again, the source material gives us this intense whiplash between massive historic expansion and deep structural hurdles.
The sheer volume of expansion is undeniable. The government recognized that education was the only way out of poverty, and they poured resources into it. The data points show primary school gross enrollment jumping from a dismal 15.2% in the early historical data to well over 100% in the more recent data sets.
Wait, I have to stop you there, because when I saw that number in the sources, I thought it was a typo. How can enrollment be over 100%? It is mathematically impossible to have more kids in school than actually exist in the country.
It seems impossible until you understand the mechanics of the metric. Gross enrollment is a specific diagnostic tool in development economics. The denominator of the equation is the total population of children who are the official age for primary school, say, ages 7 to 12. The numerator is the total number of children actually enrolled in primary school, regardless of how old they are. When you see a gross enrollment rate punch over 100%, it reveals a massive systemic bottleneck. It means the system has suddenly opened its doors, and you have a huge influx of overage children entering the system late. You have 14 or 15-year-olds who previously had no access to education finally getting a chance, and they are sitting in first-grade classrooms alongside 7-year-olds.
It's like a highway on-ramp. If the highway was closed for years and you suddenly open the gates, you don't just get the normal flow of traffic. You get every single car that has been waiting on the side roads trying to merge into a single lane all at once. The volume is incredible, but the speed of the traffic grinds to a halt.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. It is a massive backlog, and that backlog is compounded by high repetition rates because classrooms are incredibly overcrowded, sometimes 60 or 70 students to a single teacher, and because many of these students are suffering from the cognitive effects of the stunting we just discussed, the failure rates are high.
So they just stay in the system longer.
Right, kids have to retake grades multiple times. What the data tells us is that the system is expanding rapidly in quantity. They are aggressively building the physical schools and getting bodies into the rooms, but it is deeply struggling with quality. The infrastructure is buckling under the weight of the demand.
But within this chaotic education data, there is a massive bright spot, a real structural triumph that could change the trajectory of the whole country. And that is the narrowing of the gender gap. The data shows female primary completion rates surging from a staggeringly low historical baseline of just 11.1% to a point where youth female literacy has practically skyrocketed. The Gender Parity Index, the GPI, is steadily marching toward 1.0, which represents total equality in enrollment between boys and girls.
The magnitude of this shift cannot be overstated. From a purely economic and societal perspective, moving the needle on female literacy is perhaps the single highest return on investment policy a developing nation can execute. The historical baseline was one of severe structural gender inequality, where girls were kept home for domestic labor or early marriage.
I've read about the cascading effects of this. The data shows that teaching a woman to read doesn't just change her life, it mechanistically alters the entire economic and biological destiny of her future family, right?
The mechanisms are incredibly well documented. An educated woman enters the formal economy, increasing the household income. But more importantly, an educated mother has a fundamentally different relationship with public health. She is statistically much more likely to understand the necessity of vaccinating her children. She's more likely to understand the concept of boiling water or using those ORS packets effectively. She tends to marry later and have fewer, healthier children, which directly alleviates that demographic carrying capacity pressure we talked about at the very beginning.
It creates a virtuous cycle. The education data feeds back into the health data, which feeds into the GDP data. But as we keep seeing in this deep dive, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Feeding, housing, and schooling 132 million people, and driving a trillion-dollar economy requires immense physical resources.
Which forces us to look at the physical toll. We have to examine the environment and the infrastructure. Because the data paints a stark, unflinching picture of what happens to the Earth itself when a population explodes and an economy tries to modernize overnight without a high-tech industrial base.
The environmental data sets show steady, significant increases in agricultural emissions, specifically methane and nitrous oxide. And alongside that, severe, persistent net forest depletion.
We have to connect this back to that demographic rural expansion. To feed a population that grew by over 100 million people, and to fuel the agricultural base of the economy, the physical footprint of farming had to expand massively. But because they lack the capital for high-yield, technologically advanced farming, they rely on extensive farming, meaning to grow more food, you just clear more land.
So they're cutting down the forests to make way for subsistence farms. And what about the emissions?
The expansion of livestock, particularly cattle, produces massive amounts of methane through enteric fermentation, basically, the digestive process of cows. Furthermore, the increased use of synthetic fertilizers to force yields out of degrading soil produces nitrous oxide. But the deforestation is the most critical issue because it isn't just an ecological tragedy, it carries huge hidden economic penalties.
Walk us through the mechanics of that penalty. Why does a farmer cutting down a forest hurt the economy?
When you clear a forest on a hillside to plant crops, you destroy the complex root systems that hold the soil together. When the heavy seasonal rains come, there is nothing to stop the water. You get severe soil erosion. The nutrient-rich topsoil literally washes away into the rivers. This degrades the land, which makes the farmer's crop yields drop. To survive, the farmer has to go further up the mountain and cut down more forest to find fresh soil. It is a vicious, self-perpetuating cycle of destruction. Furthermore, deforestation disrupts local microclimates, altering the very rainfall patterns that rain-fed agriculture entirely depends on.
And it isn't just about clearing land for food, right? It's also about fuel. Which brings us to the infrastructure data. Because while the economy is supposedly driving toward a modern service sector, the physical infrastructure for the people is still lagging decades behind.
The data on basic living facilities reveals the depth of the structural deficit. Despite the trillions in GDP, a massive portion of the rural population completely lacks access to safe, piped drinking water. They lack reliable electricity, they lack basic hand-washing facilities with soap.
So if you don't have electricity, you have to cook your food with biomass. You have to cut down trees for firewood just to boil water.
Precisely. The infrastructure gap drives the environmental degradation, but it also creates a massive public health vulnerability. The most glaring statistic in this section of the data is that while the rate is slowly dropping, the baseline rate of open defecation remains staggeringly high.
I want to highlight the physical contradiction of this, because it is maddening when you look at the data sets side by side. We are talking about an economy that is expanding its telecommunications sector. You have mobile phone networks and 4G towers spreading across the country. But the physical infrastructure on the ground in those rural villages is still battling open defecation.
When we analyze this through a public health lens, it is a catastrophic roadblock. You cannot permanently conquer infectious diseases if the population lacks the physical plumbing to safely dispose of human waste or the clean water to wash their hands.
It means the health victories we celebrated earlier are incredibly fragile. You are giving a toddler an oral rehydration salt packet to save them from a diarrheal infection, which is amazing.
Right.
But as soon as they recover, you are sending them right back out into an environment without a toilet or clean water, where the pathogen is still present in the soil and water supply.
Exactly, it's a loop.
It is a continuous cycle of reinfection that drives the chronic stunting we discussed. The superstructure of the economy, the telecom towers and the GDP charts is modernizing. But the foundational infrastructure, the plumbing, the power grid, the water pipes is fractured.
Which forces us to ask the ultimate structural question: how is this entire apparatus actually functioning? How is a country with such massive, glaring infrastructure deficits managing to build thousands of schools, roll out national vaccine campaigns, and push a GDP into the trillions? Where is the capital coming from to hold this massive, contradictory system together?
Because it clearly isn't coming entirely from a domestic tax base.
Yeah.
You can't heavily tax an informal economy of motorcycle taxis and subsistence farmers. The answer lies outside the borders. We have to look at the global life support system of this entire transformation foreign aid.
Let's pull up the data on Official Development Assistance, or ODA. The net receipts here show geometric growth. We are looking at a system that scaled from receiving tens of millions of dollars in the past to staggering sustained levels of $4 to $5 billion annually. This is driven by major donor nations and institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, and the UN.
What does that money actually do mechanically? Are they just sending pallets of physical cash to the central bank?
It takes multiple forms. Sometimes it is direct budgetary support, where international institutions provide loans or grants directly to the government to help them balance their budget and pay civil servants. Sometimes it is project-based. A donor nation agrees to fund the construction of a specific highway, a hydroelectric dam, or a network of schools. And crucially, it comes in the form of foreign currency reserves.
Why are foreign currency reserves so important?
Because a nation cannot buy international goods with its own local currency. If Ethiopia needs to import millions of doses of vaccines, or specialized machinery for a factory, or even refined petroleum to run those motorcycle taxis, the global market doesn't accept the local currency. They demand US dollars or euros. If the country isn't exporting enough manufactured goods to earn those dollars naturally, the ODA provides the hard currency necessary to keep the import economy functioning.
So if you want to connect the dots of everything we've discussed today, this is the thread that ties the paradox together. The dramatic drops in infant mortality, the surge in primary school enrollment, the infrastructure improvements, and the health clinics. They are heavily subsidized by external capital. The domestic economy simply cannot generate the revenue required to fund a national transformation of this scale.
And that deep reliance introduces an incredible existential vulnerability.
Think about the fragility of this setup. If global geopolitical winds shift, say a major donor nation goes through its own domestic economic crisis and slashes its foreign aid budget, or political priorities change and they redirect their funding to a different continent, does Ethiopia's development engine just shut off?
It is highly exposed to external shocks over which the domestic government has absolutely zero control. It proves that economic growth on paper, even trillion-dollar GDP figures, does not equal sovereign self-sufficiency. If $4 to $5 billion of external capital suddenly dried up, the central bank's ability to stabilize the currency would collapse. The ability to import essential medicines, maintain the massive school system, and service the national debt would be severely compromised.
It is like owning a high-performance sports car, but you have no money for gas, so you have to rely on your wealthy neighbor to fill the tank every single morning. The car looks great, and it can drive fast, but if your neighbor decides to stay in bed, you aren't going anywhere. So if foreign aid is the fuel, who's steering the car, we have to look at the driver. We must look at governance.
This brings us to what macroeconomists often call the Achilles heel of rapid development. We have specific, quantified metrics provided by the World Bank that track governance quality.
The data here on the macro governance indicators is incredibly grim. We are looking at specific metrics for control of corruption and government effectiveness. And the data shows these metrics are trapped deep in the negative percentiles. If you look at the global index for these indicators, the country is consistently hovering between -0.9 and -0.3.
To visualize that, if 0 is the baseline global average for a functioning, transparent bureaucracy, all the bars for this nation's institutional effectiveness are deeply entrenched on the left side, the negative side of that line.
But push back on this for me. Why does that specific metric matter so much if the GDP is still growing? If the schools are being built and the kids are surviving, why does a negative corruption score threaten the whole system?
Because it acts as the ultimate bottleneck for private capital. All the other issues we've discussed, the infrastructure deficits, the structural shift to services, even the inflation are manageable if you have highly effective, transparent institutions. But you cannot transition to a robust, industrialized economy without attracting sustainable, long-term private foreign direct investment, or FDI. And private capital is famously cowardly.
Cowardly meaning it hates risk. It needs a safe harbor.
Exactly. If an international manufacturer wants to invest $100 million to build a state-of-the-art textile factory, the kind of factory that would absorb thousands of those rural youths and start a true industrial revolution, they need guarantees. They need to know their contracts will be honored in a fair court of law. They need to know they won't be subject to arbitrary regulatory shakedowns by local officials demanding bribes. They need to know the power grid will be managed competently.
So when the control of corruption metric is sitting at -0.9, the board of directors at that international company looks at the data, gets spooked, and decides to build their factory in a different country instead.
Precisely. The private capital stays away. And when the private capital stays away, the country cannot build a self-sustaining industrial base. It remains trapped in that informal service economy, and the government is forced to continue relying on state-led debt and massive infusions of foreign aid to fund everything. The weak institutions lock the paradox in place.
So if we step back and look at the entire dashboard, the transformation paradox is complete. You have a booming population of 132 million people. You have a skyrocketing GDP driven by a massive leap straight from rural farming into the informal service sector. But it is all built on a foundation of foreign aid dependency, severe environmental strain, chronic childhood malnutrition, wealth-destroying hyperinflation, and weak, unpredictable institutions. It is a massive, glittering skyscraper built on a foundation of sand.
To cross what economists call this transformation trap, the data suggests the nation must fundamentally pivot its entire macroeconomic strategy. For the past 2 decades, the focus has entirely been on quantity expansion.
Meaning more, just more of everything. More people, more schools built, more vaccines delivered, more total GDP generated.
But the math of quantity expansion eventually runs out. The next phase, the phase that will determine if this paradox resolves into lasting prosperity or structural collapse, requires quality deepening.
Quality deepening. So moving from just getting 100% of kids into a crowded classroom to ensuring they have a well-trained teacher and can actually read and do advanced math. Moving from just helping infants survive diarrheal diseases to eliminating the chronic malnutrition that causes cognitive stunting.
Yes. It requires implementing the austere monetary policies necessary to curb the hyperinflation that actively steals from the poor. It means slowly weaning the economy off its reliance on foreign aid by developing a robust domestic tax base. And most importantly, it means doing the grueling, unglamorous political work of building unshakable, transparent, corruption-free institutions that can attract global private capital.
And for you listening, here is the ultimate so what? Why does this specific deep dive into Ethiopian data matter to you, wherever you are in the world? Because this nation is a microcosm for the entire developing world, particularly across the African continent and parts of South Asia. The success or failure of navigating this exact paradox won't just affect one nation's borders. It will dictate the geopolitical and economic stability of an entire hemisphere in the 21st century.
The variables are universal. The youth demographic booms, the intense climate pressures on agriculture, the reliance on external aid, the struggle to industrialize in a modern era, these are shared challenges across dozens of nations right now. If Ethiopia can solve this complex equation, it provides a viable blueprint for billions of people to exit poverty. If the structural contradictions cause the system to buckle, the economic and migratory reverberations will be felt globally.
Which leaves me with a final provocative thought for you to mull over as we wrap up this data stack. For over half a century, the global blueprint for how a developing nation escapes poverty was simple, linear, and practically guaranteed. Move the farmers into cities, build massive factories, export cheap physical goods to the West, and slowly build a taxable middle class. But look at the world right now. That window of low-wage manufacturing is rapidly closing due to artificial intelligence, robotics, and shifting global supply chains. If countries are now forced to bypass the factory floor entirely, if they are jumping straight to informal service economies funded by international aid, while simultaneously facing massive climate hurdles and population booms, are we watching the birth of a completely new, vastly more fragile blueprint for nation building? And if this new, untested model collapses under the weight of its own paradoxes, who is going to catch the pieces?
It's a question that challenges every fundamental assumption we have about how the modern global economy is constructed.
It really is. We started this deep dive talking about an airplane dashboard giving seemingly impossible conflicting signals climbing fast while the engines run out of fuel. We've looked at the dials, we've unpacked the data, and we've seen just how incredibly complex the physical reality of a transforming nation can be. Thank you for taking this deep dive into the sources with us and for helping us bring this knowledge to life. Keep questioning the data, keep looking for the mechanisms underneath the headlines, and we'll see you next time.